The medbay reeked of antiseptic and confusion. Dr. Ral'ek stared at the slab where the human lay, surrounded by instruments, flashing amber warnings. The diagnostic screens were losing their composure. Pulse rate erratic. Internal temperature unstable. Oxygen levels spiking. Tissue damage catastrophic. And yet the human, bleeding, grinning, and half-scorched, was laughing. "You should see the other guy," Sergeant Mason drawled, his voice thick with humor and blood. Ral'ek's 4 eyes blinked independently, a biological reflex that his species used to express disbelief. "The other what?" His translator clicked uncertainly. "The other guy," Mason repeated, as if that explained the absurdity of a creature surviving with multiple lacerations, a fractured femur, and second-degree plasma burns across 60% of his torso. "You know, the one who did this." Ral'ek leaned in, translucent membranes shifting nervously over his oculars. "You should not be alive," he said, sounding almost offended. "You suffered trauma sufficient to render most species into nutrient slurry." Mason just laughed harder, and a trail of red trickled down his chin. The rest of the medbay was frozen in horrified fascination. The alien nurses whispered among themselves, the flutter of their tendrils sharp and frantic. Humans were a rare sight on the medical decks of the Galactic Coalition. Mostly because they didn't need them. Or, Ral'ek thought grimly, because they didn't survive long enough to require one. "All right, big guy," Mason muttered, trying to sit up before Ral'ek forced him down with a nervous snap of his forelimbs. "I've had worse." Ral'ek nearly dropped his scanner. "You have had worse? You are missing 40% of your dermal layer." "Yeah," Mason said, half smiling through the pain. "That's about my Wednesday." Ral'ek backed up a step, all 4 of his eyes locked on the incomprehensible thing before him. His tail, a thin, scaled appendage used for balance, flicked in agitation. The last time he had seen a being in this condition, it had been a casualty of the Vorath Wars. The autopsy had lasted 4 days. "Mason?" He was asking for a drink. Ral'ek turned to the medic team. "We require regenerative stasis immediately. Begin protein infusion, cellular knitting, and sedation." "No sedation," Mason interrupted. Ral'ek froze mid-command. "That is not an option. Your nervous system should be incapacitated from shock." The human's grin widened, teeth flashing white against the grime. "Should be." For the first time in his career, Dr. Ral'ek's scales paled from turquoise to a sickly gray-blue. "How are you conscious?" he wanted to ask. How can something so fragile pretend to be indestructible? But his translator stuttered under the weight of his panic. Instead, he managed, "This will hurt." Mason's eyes twinkled with the spark of someone who had made peace with pain long ago. "Doc," he said, "everything worth surviving hurts a little." The medbay went silent. Even the machine seemed to hesitate. As the healers began the treatment, layers of regenerator gel hissing as they sealed into place, Ral'ek watched, transfixed. The human's tissue reacted violently to the alien compounds. There should have been rejection, necrosis, collapse. Instead, the cells adapted. He zoomed in the scan. "Impossible," he whispered. "Your cells are consuming the gel?" "No, repurposing it." Mason groaned as the regeneration accelerated, his muscles twitching like living cords under his skin. "Guess my body didn't read your instruction manual." Ral'ek tried to keep his composure. He had trained at the Vokian Medical Institute, studied across 17 worlds, healed over 60 species, but none of them did this. None could weaponize biology this way. "What are you?" Ral'ek murmured. "Human," Mason said, as if the word should have answered every question in the galaxy. The doctor's upper hands fiddled with his data slate, while his lower pair continued monitoring vitals. "You metabolize painkillers at 4 times the galactic average. Your clotting factor this is absurd, it's generating synthetic platelets. And your adrenal glands, stars above, your body is keeping you alive through sheer chemical violence." Mason chuckled. "That's about right." The other medics, pale and trembling, began recording everything. The Coalition had long been aware that humans were resilient, perhaps even dangerously so, but seeing it up close, under surgical light, was something else entirely. Ral'ek found himself narrating his disbelief into the recorder. Subject exhibits hyperregenerative clotting. Nervous system displays catastrophic damage tolerance. Potential mechanisms unknown. Subject remains conscious during full-scale dermal reconstruction. Still awake, Mason muttered, eyes fluttering. Still ugly, too. Ral'ek blinked all four eyes again. You jest? In this state? Humor helps, Mason said simply. Can't let the pain win. That line lodged itself somewhere deep in Ral'ek's mind. His species didn't laugh. They didn't smile. Pain was pain, something to be endured, feared, or fled. But here was a creature bleeding out on his table, facing death with a grin. When the worst of the procedure ended, Ral'ek allowed himself a breath. Your recovery speed is statistically implausible. Statistically awesome, Mason said, weakly saluting. The alien doctor sighed, a low, flute-like sound of disbelief. You were struck by plasma fire at close range. You fell 10 meters onto jagged ferrocrete. You should not even be speaking. Mason glanced down at the bandages wrapping his arm. You should see me after a bar fight. Ral'ek stared. That was not a jest? Mason only smirked. Depends on the bar. Outside the medbay's viewport, the planet below glowed with orange fire. The human unit had been pulled from the wreckage of a skirmish on the colony world of Ifra 9. The Coalition had sent peacekeepers, Ral'ek among them, to treat the wounded. None of them expected humans to be among the survivors. Why did you come here? Ral'ek asked finally. The report said this sector was unstable. No one volunteers for this mission. Mason's eyes opened a little wider. For a moment, Ral'ek thought he saw something old behind them, grief, maybe. Or memory. Someone had to, Mason said quietly. Can't leave people behind. Not how we're built. The doctor studied him for a long moment. There was no bravado in that answer. Just conviction, carved into bone. When Mason finally drifted into sleep, heart still inexplicably strong, vitals slowly stabilizing, Ral'ek turned to his recorder once more. Observation, he murmured. Humans exhibit not only physical resilience but psychological defiance of biological norms. The subject endures suffering with laughter. I hypothesize that this behavior, rather than their biology, may be the true secret of their survival. He hesitated, looking back at the unconscious man. In short, Ral'ek said softly, they refuse to die properly. From the far corner, one of the junior medics, small, trembling, still pale, whispered, Doctor, what if the Coalition has misclassified them? Ral'ek turned. In what sense? The medic swallowed. We list them as Class 3 mammaloids. But maybe there's something else. The alien healer looked back at the sleeping human, the rise and fall of his chest steady, defiant. Yes, Ral'ek said. Perhaps they are. Outside, the alarms of another incoming transport echoed through the bay. More wounded. More chaos. And Ral'ek knew more humans. He stared down at Mason one last time before turning away. He had studied anatomy. He had studied cells. He had studied pain. But he realized now, he had never studied will. And for the first time in his long, sterile career, Dr. Ral'ek felt something very close to fear. The alarm started before sunrise, if Ifra 9 had a sunrise anymore. Dr. Ral'ek's head jerked up as the medbay doors hissed open. 2 stretcher teams stormed in, shouting over each other in a dozen languages. Blood, smoke, and the stench of melted armor filled the air. Ral'ek's translator lagged for a fraction of a second, overwhelmed by the cacophony. Unit 3 down, explosive decompression in Corridor C. 2 humans, 1 Vokian, major plasma trauma. The human walked here with a broken femur, Doc. What do we do with that? Ral'ek's mandibles twitched. You treat them. He pushed past the chaos toward the first stretcher, another human. This one wasn't Sergeant Mason. This one was a woman, shorter, leaner, and somehow standing under her own power despite the carbon scoring across her side. "Sit," Ral'ek ordered. "You are hemorrhaging." The human's jaw tightened. "So stop me from doing that," she snapped. Her name tag read Lieutenant S. Alvarez. Her blood pressure was catastrophically low, but her glare could have powered a reactor. Ral'ek muttered to himself as he worked. "How many of you are on this planet?" "Enough," Alvarez said through gritted teeth. "We're like cockroaches, you'll never get rid of us." The doctor paused. "I do not know what that is." "You don't want to." Behind them, Sergeant Mason was sitting upright on his recovery bed. Sitting. His body, which had looked like a battlefield just hours ago, was visibly knitting itself together. He had stripped down to the waist, flexing his regrown skin as if testing new armor. "Doc," Mason called out cheerfully. "You got any breakfast around here?" Ral'ek spun around. You should be immobile. You are still under recovery protocol." "Yeah, but lying around's boring." Mason swung his legs over the side and tried standing. His knees wobbled, but he grinned through it. "See? Good as new." The doctor's 4 eyes went wide. "Your bones were fractured. Now they're not." Ral'ek pressed a trembling hand to his cranial ridges. "This is medically obscene." Alvarez glanced over at Mason and barked a laugh that ended in a cough. "Told you not to underestimate Terrans, Doc. We don't break easy." "I am not underestimating," Ral'ek snapped, flustered. "I am trying to comprehend how you exist." Before anyone could respond, the intercom crackled. "Medical deck, brace for impact. Orbital debris incoming." The floor rumbled. Lights flickered. Something massive struck the ship's hull with a roar that rattled teeth. A few alien medics shrieked and dove under tables. Ral'ek steadied himself against the console. When the shaking subsided, Mason looked up from his half-healed arm. "That's not debris," he said grimly. "That's a boarding ship." Ral'ek blinked. "A what?" "Enemy troops," Alvarez said, already pulling herself to her feet despite the plasma burn along her ribs. "They're coming for survivors." Ral'ek's heart seized. "You cannot fight!" "You are." "Bleeding?" "Yeah. Still got a trigger finger, though." She reached for her weapon. It was cracked, half fused from heat damage. Mason grabbed a nearby crate, snapped it open, and began assembling something with terrifying confidence: parts of a plasma welder, a surgical injector, and what looked disturbingly like the medbay's defibrillator. Ral'ek stared. "What are you building?" "Improvised persuasion device," Mason said, tightening a bolt. "Otherwise known as a gun." "That is medical equipment." "Not anymore." The doctor's tail lashed the air in panic. "You cannot possibly." The ship trembled again. This time, the noise wasn't distant. The sound of metal being cut open echoed through the hall. The boarding party was inside. Alvarez took cover behind an overturned stretcher, her jaw clenched. Mason passed her a small, humming component. "Hold this steady. If they breach, duck." Ral'ek's brain screamed at him to hide. He was a healer, not a soldier. His kind had banned warfare centuries ago. But the humans, these wounded, limping, half-dead creatures, stood their ground as if this was a normal part of triage. The bulkhead exploded inward. 4 armored figures stormed through, their armor glossy and black. The insignia of the Korth Dominion gleamed on their helmets. Before Ral'ek could even process the sight, Mason raised his makeshift weapon and pulled the trigger. A thunderclap of blue light filled the corridor. The first invader convulsed, dropped smoking to the floor. "Welcome to the medbay," Mason growled. "Take a number." Alvarez opened fire next, her shots hitting center mass. 2 more fell. The last Korth warrior lunged forward with a crackling blade, swinging at Mason's exposed arm. The blade connected, and shattered against bone. Ral'ek screamed. Mason didn't. He grabbed the attacker by the throat, slammed him into the bulkhead hard enough to dent it, then shoved him unconscious onto the deck. The medbay went silent again, save for the hiss of cooling plasma. Ral'ek stood frozen. He could smell the ionized metal, the burnt air, the faint copper tang of blood. Mason exhaled slowly, lowering the improvised gun. All clear. You, Ral'ek stammered. You just, while still injured, how did you? Mason shrugged, half grinning. You said I shouldn't be alive? Might as well make the most of it. Ral'ek was speechless. He looked from the unconscious attackers to the two battered humans. They were bleeding, exhausted, and yet both were smiling. Alvarez leaned against the wall, breathing heavily. Doc, I need you to patch up the Korth. He's still breathing. Ral'ek blinked all four eyes. The enemy? He tried to kill you. Yeah, Alvarez said simply, sliding down to sit beside the wall. But that's your job, right? To heal everyone? That silenced him. He looked at her, at Mason, at the wounded invader. For a long moment, the alien doctor's instincts battled within him. Then, finally, he sighed. Yes, he said quietly. It is. He moved to the Korth's side, his hands steady despite his shaking mind. As he began working, Mason crouched beside him, watching curiously. You know, Mason said conversationally, for a guy who just watched us turn your medbay into a war zone, you're taking this pretty well. Ral'ek gave him a withering look. I am not taking it well. I am dissociating. Mason chuckled. That's the spirit. You humans, Ral'ek muttered as he sealed the Korth's wounds. You fight, you bleed, and then you laugh. How? Why? Because if we stop laughing, Mason said softly, we start thinking about what we've lost. That quiet honesty hit harder than the explosion had. Ral'ek paused his work for a moment. The thought of pain as a companion, laughter as defiance, it was incomprehensible. But perhaps that was the point. Moments later, the ship's comms came alive. All decks, enemy retreat confirmed. Damage control teams mobilizing. Alvarez exhaled. Mason leaned back against the wall, grinning tiredly. Ral'ek finished sealing the Korth's injuries and stood, his scales darkened with exhaustion. You humans, you survived by madness. Mason's smile turned gentle. Maybe. But it works. The lights flickered again, the hum of the ship stabilizing. In the medbay, surrounded by the wreckage of battle and the smell of ozone, Ral'ek realized something unsettling. He was no longer horrified. He was curious. And beneath that curiosity, something else was growing, something like awe. Because the humans weren't just surviving. They were teaching him, in real time, the anatomy of resilience. And he had a terrible feeling the galaxy had only begun to see what they were capable of. The sirens didn't stop. Even after the Korth boarding party was driven off and the fires in the medbay were extinguished, the ship pulsed with red light like a wounded beast refusing to die quietly. Dr. Ral'ek hadn't slept in 28 standard hours. His hands shook, not from fatigue, but from something far stranger. He wasn't sure whether it was adrenaline, disbelief, or admiration. He'd seen humans fight. He'd seen them bleed. But what came next, he realized, would make everything before look tame. Because Ifra 9 wasn't safe yet. And the humans weren't done. Doc, Mason said, limping toward him as if he hadn't just torn half his muscle fibers in the last fight. We've got a problem. Another? Ral'ek asked weakly. What now? Hull breach? Reactor failure? A god descending to ask what in the stars I'm doing with my life? Close, Mason said grimly. Korth aren't retreating. They're regrouping planetside. If they get their plasma artillery set up, this ship's toast. Ral'ek's spines bristled. We are in orbit. You cannot fight them from here. Not from here, Mason said. But someone's gotta go down there and make sure they don't fire it up. Ral'ek's upper hands tightened on his datapad. You cannot possibly mean. Yep. Dropship launch in 10. Mason grinned, half wild, half exhausted. Guess who's volunteering? Ral'ek's mandibles twitched. You are barely repaired. Your internal systems. Working fine. Your bone density is still compromised. Never stopped me before. Ral'ek let out a frustrated trill that in his species' language meant this is suicide disguised as optimism. Why must you do this? Mason tilted his head. Because if we don't, people die. And because... He smirked faintly. You still don't believe we can. Ral'ek wanted to deny it. But he couldn't. He followed Mason to the launch bay, where Lieutenant Alvarez was already prepping gear. She looked even worse than before. Half her armor was melted, and her left arm trembled as she loaded a power cell. You are both insane, Ral'ek declared. Statistically speaking, this mission's survival odds are less than 1%? Alvarez said, tightening her straps. Cool. Better odds than last time. Mason grinned at her. Let's go make history. Ral'ek grabbed Mason's arm before he could step aboard the dropped shuttle. If you go down there in this condition, you will not return. Mason looked him dead in the eye. Doc, if we don't go, nobody comes back. Then he smiled, a tired, reckless smile that somehow carried the weight of entire civilizations. Ral'ek had no words. He could only watch as the dropship sealed, its engines whining to life. As the shuttle detached from the hangar, streaking toward the burning planet below, Ral'ek felt something he had never felt before as a doctor. Helplessness. He turned back to the medbay. He should have gone to treat the others, to prepare for new casualties. Instead, he found himself staring at the viewport, watching that small glowing speck vanish into the clouds of fire. May your impossible physiology protect you, he whispered. The surface of Ifra 9 was hell incarnate. Flames tore through forests of twisted metal. The air shimmered with plasma residue. The ground was a graveyard of ships, Korth, Coalition, human. Mason and Alvarez hit the dirt hard, the dropship's hull half melted by reentry. You alive? Mason shouted over the storm. Define alive. Alvarez coughed, kicking open the hatch. Breathing? Yeah. Functional? Ask me later. They staggered out, weapons ready. Through the smoke, they could see the glow of Korth plasma cannons being assembled in the distance. The alien silhouettes moved with mechanical precision, dozens of them, armored, relentless. Think we can take them? Alvarez asked. Not all, Mason said. But we don't have to. Just need to make them regret showing up. He slapped the side of his chest plate, activating the biogel pack Ral'ek had injected earlier. The stuff burned like acid at first, but then, impossibly, the pain faded, replaced by a surging energy that made him feel invincible. Doc's miracle juice, he said with a grin. Hope he's not lying about the side effects. Alvarez smirked. What side effects? Something about neuro-overclocking, cardiac strain, spontaneous combustion. Comforting. They started moving through the wreckage, silent but swift. Every few steps, Mason winced as his half-healed leg threatened to give out. But he pushed forward. Ahead, Korth soldiers stood guard near a massive plasma array, a cannon tall enough to shoot down cruisers. All right, Mason said, crouching behind a shattered hull. We plant the explosives at the base, trigger the failsafe, and run like hell. Alvarez nodded. Simple. I like simple. But before they could move, a metallic voice echoed from the darkness. Terrans. They froze. Out of the haze stepped a massive Korth officer, armor black as obsidian, eyes glowing red. His plasma blade hummed with hungry light. You kill my soldiers, he snarled. You bleed my world. And still you crawl back, wounded, desperate. Why? Mason straightened slowly. Because we don't know when to quit. The Korth tilted his head. A flaw. Or a weapon. Both, Alvarez muttered. The Korth lunged. Mason shoved Alvarez aside just as the plasma blade cleaved through where she'd stood. Sparks flew as it grazed Mason's arm, burning deep into muscle. He gritted his teeth, swung his rifle up, and fired point blank. The energy slammed into the Korth's armor but didn't penetrate. The alien roared, backhanding Mason across the chest. He crashed into the debris, breath gone, ribs screaming. Alvarez fired from cover, hitting the Korth's shoulder joint. The alien staggered, but didn't fall. Human endurance, the Korth growled. Legend exaggerated. Mason spat blood, standing again. Try me. He charged. The next seconds blurred, metal, fire, motion. The Korth swung. Mason dodged barely, using every drop of Ral'ek's experimental biogel to keep his shattered body moving. He ducked under another strike and drove a plasma grenade into the Korth's armor joint. Boom! He whispered. The explosion tore the Korth backward, armor shattering in molten arcs. Alvarez limped toward him, firing to cover. Mason collapsed to his knees. His lungs felt like glass. The world tilted. But through the smoke, he saw the cannon still glowing, powering up. Alvarez, he coughed. You gotta disable it. She looked at the console. Too late. The weapon was already cycling up. They were out of time. Mason stumbled to his feet again, one hand on his side, the other holding the detonator. Guess this is it. Alvarez's eyes widened. No. No, you're not. He smiled faintly. Told the doc I'd make the most of it. Mason. Tell Ral'ek. He coughed, laughter bubbling up through the pain. Tell him we really are built different. And with that, he pressed the trigger. High above, in orbit, Ral'ek's sensors flared. Energy spike, planetary surface, shouted one of the technicians. Massive plasma feedback, then collapse. Ral'ek ran to the viewport, his heart's pounding. Below, a brilliant blue-white bloom lit up the clouds. Then silence. He stared at it, frozen. The medbay was quiet. Even the wounded stopped whispering. Was that? One nurse began. Yes, Ral'ek said softly. That was them. The explosion died down, leaving only faint ion trails glowing against the night side of the planet. Ral'ek gripped the edge of the console, his voice shaking. They destroyed the weapon. But at what cost? He didn't get an answer. All he could do was watch the fire fade, and wonder if any human could truly be extinguished by something as small as death. For 12 hours, the medbay stayed quiet. No transports. No radio calls. No dropship signals. Just silence. Dr. Ral'ek paced between the operating tables, his claws clicking against the metal floor, his eyes darting every few seconds to the viewport. He had replayed the explosion footage at least 50 times. The data was inconclusive, the sensors blinded by the plasma flare, but his gut told him what logic refused to say. Sergeant Mason and Lieutenant Alvarez were gone. He tried to continue working, suturing a Vokian's ruptured lung, stabilizing a Sarn pilot, but the motions felt hollow. Every life he saved only reminded him of the one, two, actually, he hadn't. And then, when the exhaustion had finally pushed him toward a restless, hopeless sleep, the comm system crackled to life. Medbay, this is Drop Shuttle Grey Dawn. Requesting immediate docking clearance. Ral'ek froze. Every eye in the medbay turned toward the intercom. Repeat, came the voice, hoarse but unmistakably human. This is Grey Dawn. 2 survivors inbound. Make that 1.5. Mason's missing a few parts. The medbay erupted in motion. Ral'ek didn't realize he moved until he was already running, legs trembling, hearts racing, translator clicking incoherently in excitement. When the docking doors opened, smoke poured out. The shuttle's hull was half slag, its thrusters sputtering weakly. Inside, Alvarez sat slumped against the bulkhead, her armor cracked, her arm in a sling. And beside her, bloody, burned, and still somehow grinning, was Sergeant Mason. Hey, Doc, he croaked. Miss us? Ral'ek didn't even answer. He shoved his way forward, catching Mason before he could collapse. His limbs moved automatically, scanners flicking, tendrils of medgel sealing wounds, autosutures snapping into place, but his mind was still somewhere between disbelief and awe. You were dead! Ral'ek sputtered. I saw the explosion! The temperature exceeded 6,000 degrees. Yeah, Mason muttered, wincing as Ral'ek injected another stabilizer. It was toasty. 10 out of 10, would not recommend. Alvarez coughed out a laugh. You can't kill that idiot. Believe me, I've tried. Ral'ek looked between them, scales rippling in agitation. How? How? Your escape trajectory, your shuttle was destroyed. Yeah, Mason said, voice weak but steady. Turns out Ral'ek's miracle juice burns hotter than Korth plasma. Kept us alive long enough to hit the ground and hijack one of their transports. Guess it wasn't just a med formula after all. Ral'ek blinked. It replicated your cellular resilience. He realized aloud. My compound, your biology adapted it further. You evolved the treatment in real time. Mason smirked faintly. Sounds like something we'd do. The doctor's upper hands were trembling as he stabilized Mason's vitals. You, humans are terrifying. Thank you, Mason said, already slipping toward unconsciousness. Alvarez smiled weakly. He means that as a compliment, document. Ral'ek wasn't sure he did. But as the monitor steadied and the human's breathing evened out, something inside him, something deep and unfamiliar, began to stir. Pride. He turned to his team of alien medics. Prepare regeneration pods. And someone record every variable in this treatment cycle. The coalition needs to see this. One of the junior nurses hesitated. Doctor, the coalition banned experimental human augmentation after. Ral'ek's eyes glowed faintly, all four narrowing. Then the coalition will need to reconsider. 3 days later, the Orleans drifted above a quiet planet. The Korth fleet had retreated completely, and the surviving coalition soldiers were finally getting some rest. In the observation deck, Ral'ek stood beside the viewport, staring at the stars. Behind him, footsteps approached. Don't suppose you've got coffee up here, Doc? Mason's voice rasped, softer but alive. Ral'ek turned. The human was pale, his body still swathed in regeneration mesh, but he was walking. Walking. Alvarez followed a few steps behind, arms still bandaged but smirking. He snuck out of the medbay again. Ral'ek sighed. Of course he did. Mason leaned on the railing beside him. So, we win? Yes, Ral'ek said. Though I am not certain the term when properly encapsulates the level of destruction involved. That's usually how we do. It, Alvarez said dryly. Ral'ek's upper eyes tracked the stars, his lower ones studied the humans. Your capacity for survival remains incomprehensible. Even my enhanced serum cannot account for this. Mason shrugged. Guess we just really hate dying. Ral'ek was quiet for a long moment. Then he said softly, You laughed while dying, Sergeant. You made humor from agony. And then you refused to stay dead. I do not know if that is strength or madness. Mason smiled faintly. Usually both. Something like a chuckle escaped Ral'ek, thin, uncertain, but real. My species once believed survival was the result of biology, not will. You've forced me to question that. Alvarez tilted her head. You mean you're learning to be human? Ral'ek considered it. Perhaps learning to understand humanity is more accurate. Becoming human seems dangerous. Mason barked a laugh that made his ribs ache. You're not wrong. They stood there in silence for a while, the hum of the ship steady beneath them. Through the glass, Ifra 9 looked peaceful now, a scarred planet slowly healing, much like its defenders. Ral'ek finally spoke again. I filed a report to the Coalition High Council. I described your physiology, your regenerative capacity, but also your psychology. The Council will not believe me. What did you tell them? Alvarez asked. Ral'ek looked at her, his expression unreadable. That humanity's greatest organ is not its heart, nor its brain, but its will. It defies medical classification. Mason grinned. Guess we'll take that as a compliment. It was meant as both a compliment, Ral'ek said, and a warning. He turned to face the stars again. You are a species that endures pain as if it were an old friend. You fight death the way others fight disease. And when logic dictates you should fail, you laugh. Alvarez smiled faintly. That's the trick, document pain's not the enemy. Fear is. Ral'ek considered that in silence. Then, slowly, he nodded. The intercom buzzed. Dr. Ral'ek, Incoming transmission from the Coalition's Science Division. They request your presence for a briefing. Ral'ek sighed. And so begins the cycle of disbelief. Mason stretched, wincing at the motion. Tell them the truth, document. That we're not special. Ral'ek frowned. You are very much special. Mason shook his head. No. Just stubborn. He turned, limping back toward the corridor with Alvarez's help. We don't survive because we're built different. We survive because we refuse to quit. Ral'ek watched them go, the faint hum of their laughter echoing down the hall. For a long time after they left, he stood there in silence. Then he opened his recorder and began dictating one final note. Medical log, Dr. Ral'ek, final observation. Human biology defies rational understanding. Their regenerative capabilities, though remarkable, are merely a reflection of their psyche. Their true advantage lies in an unquantifiable variable, defiance. They do not heal because their cells are stronger. They heal because they believe they will. They do not endure pain because they enjoy it. They endure because they see it as proof of survival. Recommendation: the Coalition should approach humanity with caution and gratitude. Should they ever decide that pain is optional, the galaxy will have no defense. He stopped recording, the faintest trace of amusement curling across his mandibles. Alien healer asked how humans survive so much damage. He murmured. I suppose the answer is simple. Ral'ek turned toward the medbay doors, where the echoes of laughter still lingered like an unkillable heartbeat. They don't survive it, he said softly. They conquer it. And for the first time in his long, orderly career, Dr. Ral'ek laughed.